time I'm gonna drill team. My dog sucks.
People, that was the bell. Let's get class started. So, today in class we're going to be covering China, Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. So you know how China had the jade? They also had rose quartz, and they used it to carve things with the goddess of peace. So this is going to be our can of peace. You're not going to talk, you're going to be polite. We're not going to have any of that bad stuff we have in class usually. Okay. So, countries like Japan, Korea, and Tibet began to emulate China and their governments and everything they did. So, what we're doing today is following the path of Japanese development and how China influenced countries like Vietnam and Tibet. Buddhism played a major role in all of these places, and Japan and Korea mainly focused on their relationship with China. Vietnam actually went in and communicated and traded with other people in Japan. Tried to copy China in nearly every way, but because of the Taika reforms, which was when they tried to establish a Confucian-style bureaucracy and a military comprised of conscripted peasants like that of Han and Tang China. But these reforms alienated the aristocracy because it took away their power. All of these reforms made nobles and peasants alike wish for a return to the old ways. Buddhist monks eventually became involved in the place for power. One such monk plotted to marry Empress Kokin, and when the plot was discovered, they decided that their power needed to be taken away and that women couldn't rule. Eventually, Kokin's husband ran away to Nara, or Kyoto, where he established a new capital where the monks weren't allowed to build their monasteries. So to circumvent this, they built their monasteries in the hills surrounding the city, eventually gaining access to the city and once again becoming involved in the court. This caused the emperor to end the reforms, making it easier for the aristocrats to take away imperial power. After this, the court became very protocol. People were only allowed to wear certain things, and the people became very involved in gossip, love affairs, and social status. The high nobles lived in huge maze-like palaces, and the men and women competed in the arts. With the first novel being written by Lady Murasugi, it told the life of Genji, an emperor's son, and the life of his descendant. And in court, while women were expected to be cultured and educated, they were not supposed to openly go out for significant others, but sometimes they did this with as much gusto as the men.
Countries that were at one point under China, Korea was the most sinified. The Koreans pandered to the Chinese by giving them gifts, and the Chinese accepted it instead of conquering them. The major channel of trade for the Koreans was the tribute system, which were scholars and merchants studying in academies and monasteries. Most of the government was occupied by aristocrats. The Korean elite preferred Buddhism and endowed Buddhist monasteries and art. Buddhist monks were present with powerful people. Because the Korean elite preferred Buddhism, Buddhist monks were often present with powerful people. The Silins were known for their pottery, and the elite had different ranks, and they didn't intermarry or socialize. Korea exported mainly raw materials. The artisans and traders' activity was limited due to the control by elite and the royal. The traders were poorly paid and didn't form a distinct class. The aristocrats were the only people who counted for anything, and basically anyone beneath them was to their service. Some of the people beneath them were government functionaries. Commoners were also called lowborn or peasants or slaves. And then miners and artisans and then it ranged from miners and artisans to servants and entertainers. The lower class periodically rose up against the ruling class, which weakened the Silla and the Koryo, which contributed to the fall of both dynasties. Eventually, the aristocratic families, they survived and elevated one of their own to the throne. And then the Mongol invasion in 1231 triggered a century and a half of conflict until the Yi dynasty was established in 1392 and ruled Korea until 1910. And they restored aristocratic dominance and links to China. And then now we're moving on to Vietnam. And Vietnam was kind of full of themselves, and they liked their culture a lot, and they didn't want to lose their identity to China. Their name derived from what the Chinese called the Nam Viet, which means the people in the south, because they're from the southern coastal area of current China. They traded silk for ivory and tortoise shells and pearls, peacock feathers, aromatic woods, and other exotic products, or what would be considered exotic to China. The Vietnamese defeated feudal lords and controlled the Red River Valley, and that gave them control to their king. And then the Vietnamese people intermarried and blended with the Mon Khmer and Thai-speaking peoples in Red River area, since they had conquered that area, which helped to form a distinct ethnic group. The Khmers were what are now known as Cambodians, and the Vietnamese spoken language was not related to Chinese. The women in Vietnam had greater freedom and more influence in their culture than in China, and the Vietnamese were pro-Buddhism, much like the Koreans, and their art and literature, which was a lot of poetry, was distinct from the Chinese. Ta-da.
Now we are going to move into the decline of imperial power. During this time, the emperor and his couriers became consumed with material items such as fashion, and left periodic power to aristocratic court families such as the Fujiwara. These families exercised exceptional influence over imperial affairs and used such influence to build a financial base for their growing power by increasing the amount of land in their control. The aristocratic families joined together with Buddhist monasteries to whittle down imperial power and to increase their own. On the other hand, provincial warrior elite also sought out land expansion and came to control labor using such power to deny resources to the aristocratic families. The elite families ruled through self-sustaining mini-states where warrior leaders, or bushis, administered law, supervised public works projects, and collected revenue. They built the most effective troops in the land, known as samurai, who were loyal to local lords but were increasingly called into the empire to protect the emperor and to keep peace. Civil strife and rampant crime appeared as the imperial government control weakened. Such trends provided critical to the emergence of the warrior class. The warrior code served to provide fearless fighters, as it stressed family honor and death rather than retreat or defeat. Otherwise, disgraced warriors turned to suicide to restore family honor and prove their courage, also known as seppuku or disembowelment. The rise in warrior class led to more rigid class barriers, even demoting the peasants to serf status. Because of this, peasants began to turn to popular Buddhism in the form of Salvationist Pure Land sect because it offered the promise of bliss in heaven for those who lived upright lives. Colorful figures such as kuya were intended to make Buddhism comprehensible and appealing to peasantry and artisans.
I came in like a samurai. The Tang dynasty crumbled in China. The aristocrats took over, and eventually they stopped sending emissaries to the crumbling Tang court. Yoritomo, the leader of the Mianmoto, had his family killed because he feared that they would betray him. This left a power vacuum at his death, and the Hojo took over the Kamakura regime from that time on. Then, in the 4th century, Ashikaga of the Minamoto revolted against the Bushi and overthrew the Kamakura. The Ashugi shogunate then took over Japan and took out all of the old aristocracy. But soon the shogunate dissolved into 300 mini-kingdoms, all warring against each other. Soon the armies consisted of commoners with pikes, and subterfuge was common. They were leaving the civilized life and going back to their uncivilized past. The regional rulers, or daimyos, established a period of social growth where luxuries were made, and the women retained their source of income because they made silks. Commoner daughters inherited their mother's position in guilds, while noble women received nothing due to male inheritance. This inheritance was common. Women were raised to only please their future husbands, and they were taught that they should die rather than be raped, and that they were not allowed to participate in plays any longer. The Japanese kept from slipping into barbarianism through Zen Buddhism and art. Chinese influence revived on a cultural level, especially their art. Big rock gardens were created, as well as very complex tea ceremonies. The fractioning of Japan actually created a strong foundation for a unified Japan, with all of the regional rulers creating a framework with roads and such. Korea has always been close to China, but has developed its own identity. Koreans came from the Siberians. They were conquered by Wendy of the Han, and when they were colonized, Chinese culture was integrated. Horsework and metalworking came from the Chinese, and they were connected to the Japanese through a small colony on their border. The first Korean state, Chosun, was conquered by the Han. Then the Goryeo in the north were in war with Silla and Pachishi of the south, as they were now fighting for control. During this time, the first wave of Sinification came through. Chinese language was adopted, and the Goryeo monarch created schools where Confucianism was taught, but failed in establishing a bureaucracy like that of China. The Tang finally conquered Korea by making an alliance with crushing the two other kingdoms. Then disagreement between the Tang and Silla arose, and finally led the Tang to withdraw. Then Silla ruled Korea until the Japanese invasion of the 20th century.
However, the Chinese exports still played a large role in the Vietnamese economy. The Vietnamese were equal to Chinese scholar gentry, but they did not have as much power. The scholar were bureaucrats whose power was also limited. There was high esteem in women that was included in Buddhist teaching. Competing power prevented Vietnamese dynasties from enjoying authority of China. The peasants were very controlled, and the Vietnamese refused to settle in malarial highlands that fringed the Red River. The Shams and the Khmers occupied the lowlands. The Vietnamese launched periodic expeditions to retaliate raids on their village. They traded with hill dwellers, but tried to minimize that because they thought of them as nude savages. And they moved south with a large population and a superior bureaucratic and military organizations. The Shams Indianized people living in lowland areas along the coast. They eventually moved to the highlands. The Vietnamese beat the Shams and clashed with Khmers, and they Indianized armies. When the French came, the Vietnamese occupied the upper delta and pushed territory to Cambodia. The Vietnamese armies and peasants moved farther from the capital, which is Hanoi, and it was hard to control the peasants because they were fighting difference between them and the Northerners came up because Southerners adopted Sunsham in Khmer cult. South, Man-wide dynasties weakened with a regional military. Commanders became less responsive to the north and slower in sending the taxes to the north. These became violent clashes to challenge claims of Trinh family who ruled the north. Rival houses sought for the right to rule Vietnam. The North and the South both wanted to unite Vietnam among a single monarchy. A long struggle absorbed Vietnam enemies and prevented them from recognizing growing external threats to the homeland.
All of the countries we have discussed had had times in their history comparable to that of others, like that of China with the warring states and that of Rome with succession issues and power vacuums.
I can't see anything. This is so, like, I feel so unappreciated. Okay, this is better. Okay, my mustard. Okay, good. Bye, guys.
I don't think it was. Oh, just recorded. Taking a video?
No, I was just. Okay, now I am.
Now you are. I baby. Oh no. The camera loves me, but
Oh dear Lord. What did? Oh.
that could have gone farther and hit me.
I came in like a wrecking ball. I never hit so hard enough.
I wanted to break your heart.
I don't know where you are. I'm trying to find you. Oh, there you are.
Stop with that.
Give me my samurai sword.
Okay, so we've got some options. Oh, bye.